Hello everyone. In this video I wanted to share some insights into Revelation 12 that I recently found out. And Revelation 12 is the chapter about the war in heaven. Remember that chapter where Satan and his angels battle against Michael and his angels and attack heaven? And it's also the chapter of the birth of the Messiah and the woman being persecuted. And there are two things I wanted to talk about regarding this chapter. But before that, I'd like to briefly discuss the whole book of Revelation. We as Christians often adopt systems of thought, right? And the book of Revelation has many systems to adopt, many eschatological systems. And there are four popular ones which I'd like to briefly share with you, see which one you fit into. Number one is the Futurist perspective, which says that the majority of the book of Revelation from chapters 4 to the end remains yet to be fulfilled. So Futurists believe the seven scrolls, the seven trumpets, the seven bowls, the judgments, and everything that happens in the book of Revelation has not been fulfilled, but yet remains to be fulfilled in the near future. And the Futurist perspective is the most popular one nowadays. So when you join a church, it's probable that your pastor and your congregation believes, or whether they realize it or not, they presuppose the Futurist perspective of the book of Revelation, okay? Also, under the Futurist system, there are some subcategories like pre-trib rapture and post-trib rapture. And the second system is the Preterist perspective on the book of Revelation. And the Preterist believes that most, if not all, of the book of Revelation has been fulfilled already, either during the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, or some believe everything was fulfilled in 70 AD. Others drag the judgments out to the ultimate demise of the Roman Empire sometime in the 4th century. So there's a lot of leeway there among preterists. And partial preterists believe that Jesus is still returning in the near future. However, there's also a position called full preterism, which believes that Jesus will not return, but has in fact already returned in 70 AD and has gathered up with him the elect already. So full preterists believe we now live in the new heaven and the new earth, and they believe that the future is only going to look better and better and better. So their outlook on the future is very positive, which is not necessarily bad, whereas the Futurist outlook on the future is very negative, right? It's only going to get worse and worse and worse until the intense persecution and so on. The church is going to be persecuted and martyred. It's only going to get worse. So that those two are the most diametrically opposed systems of the four. And the Preterist view is the most popular one among scholars. The third system is called the Idealist perspective. The Idealist sees the book of Revelation as less of a historical book and more of a spiritual book that teaches principles and truths to live by and to guide us through the ages. So the Idealist more or less allegorizes most of the book of Revelation. And if you don't know, allegorizing means you remove the setting of the book from its historical roots, and you just see the spiritual principles behind what the text is actually saying. So for the Idealist, the book of Revelation is nothing more than a book which teaches that there's always going to be evil and good fighting each other, and also great encouragement is to be found for believers when we are in time of trouble. And then the fourth system is the historicist perspective. The historicist perspective has lost favor nowadays, but it's still believed by a small minority of people, namely by the SDA Church. The Seventh-day Adventists believe this system. And the historicist view is that the judgments and all the prophecies of the book of Revelation have slowly found their fulfillment throughout history. You could say they see it as developmental prophecy. So for example, they believe the first beast in Revelation 13 to be America, and the second beast to be Rome, or more specifically the Vatican. And they also believe the Pope is the Antichrist, as the Reformers did. So like I said, the historicist view has lost favor nowadays, and most Christians believe in the futurist perspective. However, I'd like to argue for a combination of all four. We don't have to blindly cling to one particular system just because our denomination or church says so. We as Christians should be interested in the truth, and what I argue for is we take the best out of each system and then see what makes the most sense when reading different parts of the book of Revelation. Make sense? Okay, so with that out of the way, now that you understand the different types of systems of thought there are regarding the book of Revelation and eschatology, I'd like to specifically talk about chapter 12 of the book of Revelation. Okay? And there are two things I'd like to mention. The first one is when this actually takes place, the war in heaven, whether it's in the past or in the future. And then I'd like to talk about verse 4 in the chapter and what that actually means, and like to propose a different interpretation than the most popular one. Okay, and with that, let's get into the book of Revelation chapter 12. Okay, let's read the opening verses of chapter 12 and then I'll comment on it, okay? And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. Now, who was the woman here? The woman represents Israel, and Israel is about to give birth, figuratively, to the Messiah, okay? And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Okay, so who's the male child that the woman Israel gave birth to? Well, obviously the Messiah, because John quotes here Psalm 2, who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. That is a messianic psalm. So this is clearly talking about Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And the dragon obviously represents Satan. Okay, so that is the context before we get to the war in heaven. Important to note is that this chapter is referencing a past event, right? The birth of the Messiah and the persecution of Israel. That is in the past, meaning that's already happened. Now, if this is referring to Israel and the birth of the Messiah, then can we really put off the war in heaven to some future date? Can we say those two events are unrelated? Or the other extreme, can we say that the war in heaven occurred at the beginning of time before the earth was created? Because some people believe that. Can we really do that, considering the context? I'm not so sure. Now notice, now war arose in heaven. When? Now. Other translations say then. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven, And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Now I'd like to stop here. What I propose is that this war happened at the same time as the birth, the ministry, and the life of the Messiah, sometime during that interval. In fact, do you remember what Jesus said to his disciples? He said, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven," which could be talking about his defeat. When he started the war in heaven, he was thrown down to the earth when he was defeated. So this all fits in perfectly, in my opinion. So my argument is that the war happened at the same time as Jesus' ministry, and not far off in the future, nor in the distant past, but at the same time as Jesus' ministry. Make sense? And the second thing I wanted to look at was verse 4 in the book of Revelation. Let's read it again. "His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it." Now, I'd like to focus on the first part of that verse. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven. Now, we know that stars is a common metaphor for angels in apocalyptic literature, so that's what's meant here. But most Christians believe this verse is talking about a third of the angels of heaven aligning themselves with Satan in rebellion against God. Other translations say he drew down a third of the stars of heaven, which sounds a bit more like what I just said, right? That a third of the stars decided to align themselves with Satan to oppose God. However, there's a different understanding of this verse, and that is that Satan didn't convince a third of the angels to become his allies, but that he defeated a third of the angels and cast them to earth. Let's read it again. "His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth." This is in context of the war in heaven. So what I think makes a bit more sense is that Satan fights against Michael and he manages to defeat a third of the angels of heaven and casts them to the earth consequently. But it doesn't say that they became Satan's allies. In fact, the number of angels Satan has under his control is not mentioned in the Bible. But it's commonly said among us Christians that Satan controls 1/3 of the angels, right? And this idea is solely based on this one verse. And I just wanted to point out there's a different understanding of the text, and it's a debated passage, okay? My thinking is I agree more with the interpretation that Satan defeated a third of the angels rather than a third of the angels became his allies. But I'll let you decide what makes more sense to you. Okay? So those are the two things I wanted to mention briefly here in this video. Thank you for watching. God bless.